Hello and welcome to Syria Talks, the unique show exploring the intricacies of the Syria crisis. I'm your host, Danny Mackey. The ISIS horror show continues as militants take over the Syrian city of Palmyra. In the aftermath, the terror group beheaded reportedly 400 civilians by the Islamic State. Images of a black flag flying over centuries-old Islamic-era castles was posted online by the group's supporters. Hundreds of bodies were reportedly scattered in the streets after the city was seized by the ultra-hardline group. Some had been executed in cold blood. Dozens of these killed were state employees, including the head of the nursing department at the hospital and all of her family members, according to Syrian state news agency. This comes as world condemnation increases, with the UNESCO stressing concern over the fate of the World Heritage renowned site, whilst the former head of the British Army states that ground troops must now be considered to tackle Islamic State militants. Today we discuss what can be done to fight the Islamic State. To discuss this further, let me please introduce my guests, Dr. Richard Barbrooks, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster, who joins us from our studio. Also on the show, Gearóid Ó Colmáin, a political analyst. And from Amsterdam, we have joining us today Rina Netaj, political analyst and Arabist and journalist, joining us from Amsterdam. But before we begin, let's take a quick look at this video report on the latest ISIS atrocity in Palmyra.
Whilst the world still reels from ISIS ransacking artifacts and museums in Iraq, a new tragedy has occurred of equal significance. The fall of Palmyra came just days after the Islamic State captured the major Iraqi city of Ramadi. The capture of the ancient ruins at the World Heritage Site next to the modern city of Palmyra has raised international alarm. ISIS militants have destroyed several sites in Iraq, most recently the ancient city of Nimrud, one of Iraq's greatest archaeological treasures. By taking Palmyra, ISIS has stoked world fears as to the fate of Syria's most historic tourism site, with many fearing for its destruction. ISIS fighters were battling Syrian troops less than 2 kilometers from the remains of one of the most important cultural centers of the ancient world. The jihadists reached the oasis town after a lightning advance across the desert in which they overran government forces in fierce fighting that cost the lives of 110 combatants, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. UNESCO describes Palmyra as a heritage site of outstanding universal value. The ancient city stood on a caravan route at the crossroads of several civilizations, and its 1st and 2nd century temples and colonnaded streets mark a unique blend of Greco, Roman and Persian influences. After taking the town, it has been reported that ISIS have killed up to 400 civilians in another massacre, leaving the fate of Palmyra under much speculation.
Dr. Richard, if we could just start with you. What does the future of Syria look like now after ISIS taking this immensely historic city?
Well, I think you have to go back to where all this started, which was the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. If you think back, that the British and the French sat down and they carved up the Middle East into countries which suited them rather than the inhabitants. And in a way, what we're seeing at the moment is the unravelling of this settlement, which was done almost 100 years ago. And obviously there are very powerful players who want to break up these borders, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as it was called, and want to redraw the boundaries of the Middle East. And if you go on to, US military websites or some of the American neocons, they actually have maps where they show how there will be a Kurdistan that covers both bits of Turkey and Syria and Iraq. There will be a Sunni state carved out of Iraq and eastern Syria, and so on and so forth. So, I think what we have to see is that there are these outside players who are taking fault lines within the existing region and trying to reorder it.
What has instigated this chaos? This division in the Arab world, this chaos? What has been the main...
Well, I think you have to say that the original intention, certainly the Americans, when they invaded Iraq, was to turn it into the equivalent of Japan or West Germany after the Second World War. They were going to rebuild it in the image of America. And obviously, in 2003, they were on a great high because they'd triumphed in the Cold War, and they thought that Russia was going down that path already, and that the Middle East was also the last holdout. Of course, now we can see with the failure of the invasion of Iraq, actually the rather predictable failure of anyone who knew anything about the region, is that they've sort of gone back to the old imperial strategy of divide and rule, which they learned from the British, and the British learned it from the Romans. You talked about Palmyra. Well, it comes from the time when the Romans were doing the same thing in the area, which is dividing the various people against each other so they could sit on top of them and exploit them and rule the area. So I think, in a way, it's it's just very sad to think about what might happen to these ancient archaeological relics, but they tell us that empires have come and gone in this region for thousands of years.
Now, there is a global coalition to fight ISIS, which is made up of numerous countries, led by the United States.
But the United States helped create ISIS in the first place. So
how would you presume that the United States helped create ISIS?
Well, in two ways. I mean, first, it's had a long-standing alliance with Wahhabi jihadi groups, which goes back actually to the 1960s, but particularly in the 1980s when they were using the Arab Afghans, as they became known, against the pro-Russian government in Afghanistan, and then later when the Soviet Union intervened to support it, to fight against them, the whole Mujahideen, out of which came Al-Qaeda. So and then, of course, the invasion of Iraq itself has
but the
turned
US is
many
currently
people who
bombing
were
ISIS, is it not?
secular Baathists into supporting these Islamist movements.
But the United States is currently bombing ISIS, isn't it?
Well, it's not unusual that they, one moment they support somebody and then a few years later they're opposing them. So, I'm old enough to remember that at the beginning of the 1990s, the United States supported Slobodan Milosevic's regime in Serbia when they started breaking up Yugoslavia into various competing republics. Yet within 4 years later, they did a little bit of bombing against him, and then 8 years later, they bombed his regime to basically stop him ethnically cleansing Kosovo and arranged for him to be overthrown and then shipped off to The Hague.
If we could just take this to Gearóid Ó Colmáin here. ISIS controls a large part of Syria now. How does this bode, in particular, for the future of the region?
Well, I think the occupation of Palmyra is probably more symbolic than strategic, in the sense that Palmyra, of course, is a national treasure, and that will be a major worry for the Syrian government. But I don't think the city is militarily very strategic, and in fact it could be a trap, an attempt to draw the Syrian army into the desert, and then, of course, to be attacked by U.S. Forces who are ostensibly attacking, supposed to be bombing ISIS, but of course will miss their targets and end up bombing the Syrian army. We shouldn't have any illusions about the origin of ISIS and the function of ISIS. ISIS is a creation of the United States. We have proof of that now with the latest declassified documents from the Defense Intelligence Agency. But it's actually open
but the
in the Western press.
But the United States would argue that they have been the main country fighting ISIS. They have sent money and arms to countries which are fighting against ISIS. They have armed the Kurds. They've helped to arm the Iraqi government forces. And the United States is leading the fight against the Islamic State. I mean, is there real evidence to suggest otherwise?
I think there's being openly admitted. I mean, we don't even need Defense Intelligence documents, Defense Intelligence Agency documents to kind of to prove that. I mean, I can cite an article from the French press. There's an article here on the 12th of February 2015 on the Turkish Intelligence Agency. The article is about the reshuffling that took place in the Turkish parliament recently, and it's an article where the journalist openly admits that the chief of Turkish intelligence, Hakan Fidan, who was a close of Erdogan, and I'm citing and translating what the journalist says. This is the person who was known to be financing, was known to be helping the Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State in Syria, and that she describes it as a controversial politics. Now, this is a NATO member, and this is the chief of Turkish intelligence, who is known to be helping the Islamic State. Well, if you do your Aristotelian syllogism, that means that if Turkey is helping the Islamic State, and if Turkey is helping the Islamic State, then Turkey is behind the Islamic State.
Okay.
Turkey is a member of NATO, therefore NATO is a member is helping the Islamic State. I mean, so you only have to read the press with a bit of logic. It's more or less being admitted.
But the United States and Turkey would argue
West is
otherwise.
behind the Islamic State.
Numerous states within the Middle East and in the Western world would argue against that. But as we speak, ISIS is attacking the Syrian army. So, in terms of Palmyra and the city of Palmyra, I mean, how does this fall? I mean, what does this mean for Syria? Is it just a symbolic issue? Is it something which is more deep and fundamental? What does it mean for the future of Syria now?
I think we shouldn't forget that all of the regional wars in the last 20 or more years have had Zionism as a cause, the alliance between Wahhabism and Zionism. And the Zionists have no vision for a future in the Middle East. This is a very nihilistic ideology, and they're using the Wahhabite barbarians to destroy all of the heritage of the entire region.
Keep your point. We'll get back to you on this issue. If I could just go to Rina. Thanks for joining us. With recent ISIS advances in Iraq and Syria, what can the US-led coalition actually do to raise the pressure on the Islamic State?
Yes, what I actually really don't understand is that, for example, the border crossings between Syria and Iraq were still open for ISIS to control. They controlled them now, all of them. And if you destroy these border crossings, I mean, at least ISIS fighters could not keep on flocking into Iraq. Now they can flock in from Raqqa to almost near Baghdad, and Anbar tribes have been warning for months that they are so worried for all this because of all these ISIS fighters coming into Anbar from Syria. So I'm quite surprised why these border crossings were not cut off from ISIS. That's a main point I want to raise. It's really a question for me why the coalition is not doing that.
So the coalition clearly has been urged to do more, but what exactly can they do from a military perspective, apart from closing the border crossings? Is there anything fundamental they could do, perhaps a new coalition, expanding the coalition, being more assertive on the ground, more airstrikes? Is there anything from a military perspective which could be done to actually help to quell ISIS?
Yes, actually, I'm not a military expert, of course, but I see that many believe that airstrikes are really the solution. Why I think in Iraq, let's take Iraq, I think the political situation and people are making conflicts with each other and not willing to help each other, or even what we know now in Ramadi that probably Ramadi fell because of a betrayal of some parts of the Iraqi army. So I think we really have to put more pressure on the Iraqis to get their house together if they want to fight ISIS in a very good way. I think the West cannot do it alone at all. We have seen that in the past. So the Iraqis really need to get together and get their act together. And what I also understand that Prime Minister Abadi said that he does not want other Arab troops on the ground in Iraq. So the Iraqis have to do it themselves. And what I found also a surprise, by the way, that Saudi army spokes a few weeks ago said concerning to the invasion in Yemen, then we are not going to target ISIS or Al-Qaeda targets, but only Houthi targets. So how much is the Arab coalition willing even to fight ISIS? That's a big question as well. No easy answers here. It's of course an and, but if you really read in in how Mosul fell and how Ramadi fell, with corruption and leaving behind stuff. And here is a big thing to look in. And I cannot understand actually why the Americans let this happen, because it must be much more difficult to regain the city than to defend it.
Because clearly very dark things are occurring in Syria. There is a war which is occurring, but there is a war within a war, if you like. Has the world, and especially the United Nations, failed Syria to an extent?
I would say yes and no. We always said what happened in the Second World War in Europe, we will never let this happen again, and it's happening again. But Syria is of course complicated because Russia and Iran are involved. So you might end up with even a very much bigger war if the West would have interfered in Syria, having Russia and Iran against it. So it's a very complicated situation. But if you see now, for example, Europe. Are they not even, many politicians not even willing to accept refugees from Syria? This is, really, really disappointing.
Very, very. I mean, we have most European states apart from Sweden and Germany, have accepted nearly nothing of the Syrian refugees who are coming into Europe. But on this issue, I would like to pose a question to Dr. Richard. Is the issue of Syrian refugees a hindrance in terms of Western foreign policy?
Well, it's something they want to just avoid talking about, isn't it? I mean, we have this problem in all countries of the European Union of austerity. One of the things that obviously right-wing politicians like to do is not to say, don't blame the bankers for the crisis, blame the immigrants. And obviously, if you have these crises in the Middle East and also in sub-Saharan Africa, partly because of war, partly because of poverty, and people look at Europe and think, well, if they won't let us modernise our countries, we'll go and move to a country that is modern and offers our children a better standard of living. And of course, the flip side of this, of course, actually is Europe needs immigrants because we're not reproducing at enough. So in a sense, our whole economies depend on having immigrants, but as a sort of second-class citizens. So the racism...
Now back to the conflict and the crisis in the Middle East, just quickly. Certain Arab countries have a direct interest in Syria, such as Qatar, for instance, and such states have been accused by Western media of indirectly funding ISIS. I mean, what interest would they have in doing so?
Both, something like the West, in a way, would like both sides to lose. There was that famous Zbigniew Brzezinski, when he was National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s. That's what he said about the Iran-Iraq war, is it's a pity that both sides can't lose. And so in a way, the Americans, having failed to rebuild Iraq in their own image, what they're doing is they're in a sense playing both sides. On one hand, they're allied with the Israelis and the Saudis and their sort of semi-relationship with Islamic State because it's anti-Syria, it's anti-Iran. And then on the other hand, they're actually now trying to do a peace deal with Iran, which would imply that they would then be allied with Syria and even Hezbollah. And then you have Turkey that's playing both sides against each other as well. And so, I think Pepe Escobar calls it now their new strategy is to be the empire of chaos. If they can't run it, no one's going to be able to run it. It's just going to be a chaos, as they say. And so I think you need to say, people say, oh, there is a Western foreign policy. I think there isn't a single Western foreign policy. There are multiple policies that are in competition with each other. And sometimes people who want to tilt towards Israel and Saudi Arabia, often associated with the neocons in America and in England as well. They have one strategy, but there are other strategies who obviously want to make peace with Iran, for instance, because Iran used to be the great ally of the United States in the Gulf.
Iran is also an ally of the United States as we speak, especially in Iraq. Not so much in Syria, but it just shows you how enemies can turn into allies. But
well, exactly, and we've seen this in the past, the way that China was the #1 enemy of America in the 1950s and 1960s, and they supposedly invaded Vietnam because to stop the Chinese expansion to Southeast Asia. And then they, the next decade, they pivoted and suddenly they're best friends with China against the Russians. And so you could see this happening again. I mean, you said in Iraq implicitly, America and Iran are on the same side against Islamic State. But you cross the border into Syria, a border that, as we're talking about today, is disappearing, and suddenly Americans are on the other side. They're effectively on the same side as the Islamic State against the Syrian government. I'm sure if you're on the ground in the Middle East, this all must seem incredibly confusing, but it might make sense if you're looking at it for the other side of the planet in Washington, D.C., or in Langley, or wherever they're making the policy up this week.
Now, ISIS foreign fighters number around 20,000 in Syria and Iraq. What kind of threat do these groups and these individuals pose to Western countries if they return to their original homeland?
Well, there's a long-standing strategy in the Gulf, for instance. I know this from having talked to people who've lived there, of actually exporting their troublemakers, sending them off to Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, and hopefully they'll end up blowing themselves up or getting killed or traumatized, so they don't cause trouble when they come home. And you can say cynically that in a way that what they're doing is they're exporting a lot of these troublemakers from the West, sending them off to Syria, and as I said, hopefully they'll blow themselves up or get killed or something. So yes, some of them might come home, but even if they do come home, they're probably going to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder.
But this is an issue. I mean, you've lectured at university. I mean, you've come across many students. But what would make a young British student leave the UK and go and fight in a country such as Syria and Iraq? I mean, are there any social factors behind this?
Well, if you look historically, young males between 16 and late 20s, they're the standard group of people you want to recruit if you're going to go fight. They're young, they're fit, they haven't settled down with responsibilities, they make the best soldiers. What's interesting is you look at that area is actually what a small percentage of the population have really got involved in these groups. I assume in most countries that people will defend their neighbourhood, but to actually go and join these sort of groups which are not just they're not nationalists, they're pan-nationalists, aren't they? They're demanding a united Middle East united around their particular version of Wahhabism. So they're actually a very, very small percentage. And similarly, you could say in the general global Sunni Muslim population, the number of people who are attracted to join Islamic State or Al-Qaeda is an incredibly small percentage of the population. But obviously the media fixates on them partly because what we were saying earlier about the whole thing about refugees, about the way that Europe wants to create, like most countries, a sort of two-class citizenship where you have some people who are full citizens, people, and the others are usually, in the present circumstances, Muslims who are the exploitable workers across Europe. And so they basically big up these small groups of extremists. They're very media friendly. They put on great videos. They commit atrocities that ensure that they're at the top of the news headlines. But what's interesting is, in a sense, how unsuccessful they are compared to a lot of other mass movements that have been around.
Okay, if you hold that thought, and we could just take it to Gearóid Ó Colmáin for a second. Why has the world done nothing to protect Syria's ethnic minorities?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the world. The
international community.
Yeah, well, I was just going to mention the international community is basically means the United States and its client states. But that's not even half the world. I mean, most of the world is essentially Asia, China, Russia, the emerging powers in Latin America. That is also the international community, but that tends to be excluded. They've done everything. Those countries who respect international law, those countries who have done everything to bring peace to Syria, they have done everything to stop the ethnic cleansing and the violence against minorities in Syria. The Europeans, on the other hand, have done everything to foment religious and sectarian hatred. For example, by spreading the lie that the Syrian government is composed mainly of Alawites, and that there's some kind of Alawite conspiracy against the Syrian people, and they're in cahoots with the Iranians to spread the Shia
but some Western analysts would
throughout the country
ultimately
and so on.
argue and say to you that the majority of the army is from a certain sect, etc., and the majority of the government is not ruled by a constellation of different Syrian ethnic groups, but one particular Syrian group. What would you say to this in response to this?
Well, of course, a big lie. I mean, the Syrian government has done everything to have balance between different minorities in the country. So you have the foreign minister, Muallim is Sunni. You have Christians in the government and so on, and they've done everything to I think to restore balance and to make sure that there is no sense of people being left out. Of course, you can never have perfection in these kind of environments, but I think the Syrian government has always been considered by objective observers as a model, really, of a multi-ethnic state.
One question which I'm particularly interested in is, can there be direct negotiations with ISIS? I mean, if so, who do you talk to, especially when they control an area such as Palmyra, a World Heritage Site, other locations in Iraq? Isn't there a certain necessity to speak to them?
Yes, I think you should probably call Tel Aviv. You know, if you want to find out, you know, who's if you want to negotiate with the Islamic State, there's no point in talking to those barbarians on the ground. You're best, talking to the United States and Israel, the people who created them, and who are making sure now that they're taking over Syria.
But on a serious local level, especially in areas where humanitarian aid needs to be sent, there must be a form or a structure in which you can speak to ISIS. There have been numerous journalists who have visited ISIS territory. They've been given protection in certain aspects by ISIS fighters, official documentation. Isn't there a necessity in terms of areas where ISIS take over, such as Palmyra, in order to protect the culture, the history there? Isn't it worth an attempt to even speak to them?
I don't really know I don't believe that you can negotiate with an organization like ISIS. I think it was created primarily to be pardon the phrase, final solution for Syria, in the sense that it is the final phase of the war. And I think the only way that you can deal with ISIS is to defeat them militarily, because these are not rational actors. These are not people who have any kind of a coherent ideology. These are the foot soldiers of Zionism. This is a new form, a much more extreme form. I think the Israelis and the Americans realized that in order to take over and destroy and divide and conquer definitively the Middle East, you not only have to kill lots of people, but you have to destroy their heritage, destroy their culture. Because Syria, I remember I was there in 2011, just a few weeks after the violence started. And I was in Palmyra, actually. And this is a country that attracted a lot of French tourists, German tourists, a lot of Europeans. And, of course, this is the cradle of civilization. So they want to destroy that because that constitutes, in a sense, the pride and the dignity of the Syrian people, and they really want to hit that hard. We must understand the Zionists are barbarians. Zionism is not about civilization.
If you let me get back to you on this particular point while I take it to Rina. Rina, I'd like to ask you whether combating ISIS in Iraq is more important than fighting ISIS in Syria, and whether the war between the two countries is separate or intertwined.
I believe the war is intertwined. You see the flocking, as I just mentioned, from ISIS fighters to Iraq from Syria and back and forth. So it's certainly intertwined. But in Iraq there are more possibilities still to fight them, because the U.S., the West is in quite good contact with the Iraqi government, of course. But still, there are so many challenges ahead. And what I do not agree with, actually, with the speaker before me, yes, the U.S. have supported and trained Osama bin Laden, but I don't believe that the West has created really ISIS. I would argue, like you mentioned also before, if the West did not start these airstrikes against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, where would be now today? Maybe ISIS would have tried to enter Jordan already or Lebanon. But yes, the West is making a lot of mistakes as well, and we let's hope we learn from it. What I also want to add is, if you look at the history, if you listen to the speeches of Zawahiri and bin Laden, the father, Al Qaeda, like the father of the child, the worst child, ISIS, is that the first goal was to get rid of these Arab dictators, these very repressive Arab dictators. And I believe here the West still makes a big mistake to support dictators like Sisi and for example, to have no critics on the Saudis or what the Saudis are now doing in Yemen. This creates new hate against the West. And I think the fastest way to create new jihadi groups, we see it happening in Egypt, is to have an immense repression and I have no human rights whatsoever, no way to get your rights. As you know, I got convicted by Egypt also for 10 years for just nothing. So this is a point that the West ignores, because probably
isn't this symptomatic of the way Arab governments and Arab regimes and Arab political systems are? Haven't they always been this way, repressive, brutal dictatorships? Is it naive of Western governments and Western media to expect such a drastic change within Arab political systems?
That's a very good question, but I think the responsibility of the West, also because for the benefit in the future for the West, that is not to make this dictator stronger, so they get away with everything. In the Netherlands now, a politician from the biggest party, Halbe Zijlstra, is saying that we should not even raise a finger against, for example, Sisi, because he's bringing stability. But if you look close, there is no stability, because Egypt has more attacks than ever against the state. I think we had, like in the last 22 months, we had more than 700 attacks. This we never had before in the history of modern Egypt. So we see what all this mess in the Middle East, that it's coming to Europe in a sense that, you know, people in Europe want to go to the Middle East or want to come back and might accomplish a terror attack in Europe as well. So it's also in our own benefit to think of the long-term strategy and not short-term strategies, you know, and keep on dealing with the dictators. Like, for example, Assad. The West also made a deal with Assad that he doesn't have to come to The Hague for the Hariri tribunal. And, imagine if we had to come to The Hague, maybe, we never know, of course, but it turns out you cannot make deals with dictators. It's just not...
But it happens all the time, doesn't it? I mean, this is how lots of the Middle East runs. I mean, yes. Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, he was on a blacklist now, and now he seems to have improved his relations with Western countries slightly. And Gaddafi was once ousted and considered completely rejected from international affairs, and then all of a sudden he was the West's best friend before the uprising toppled him. But isn't this standard procedure, the way in which Western states deal with the Middle East? There is a kind of level playing field on this matter, isn't there?
Yes, I totally agree with you. Take Gaddafi, for example, and he was afraid that he would, the same would happen to Saddam Hussein would happen to him, so he changed his mind, and the West started to talk with him. I think it was Tony Blair, especially, who talked with Gaddafi, who's now talking with Sisi a lot, and or an advisor from Sisi. But and then Gaddafi started to order a lot of weapons, and many countries, but also European countries, sold a lot of weapons to Libya, and these weapons are fueling at the moment conflicts in the Middle East, like in Libya, but also in Mali and elsewhere. These weapons even go through to Yemen, and they go to Gaza and to Egypt. So it's not a good idea, again, to sell weapons to dictators, because they might...
Let me just hold you for 1 second. Richard Barbarouk, selling weapons to dictators, this is the theme of Western policy all across the Middle East. What's your perspective on this?
In this country, most of our, a large part of our industry was trashed under Margaret Thatcher and the subsequent governments. But one of the things that we are still successful on is making weapons. And if you make them, you may as well sell them to someone. And the people in the Middle East, as the previous speaker said, there's dictators, some of whom, particularly in the Gulf, have lots of money. So they buy expensive toys, which they then use to kill their neighbours or even each other. So I think, you should expect that. But I think to go back there, you said about, the Middle East is run by dictatorships. Well, you have to think that so was Europe until remarkably recently. We're on
Would you care to elaborate?
Well, if you think, you talk about democracy, but it's a very, very recent invention in the West. I mean, even, we're in England, we're celebrating the 800th of anniversary of Magna Carta, but this is an agreement between a few, warrior aristocrats and bishops and so on, a very small group, and the king. It took many, many, many centuries before everyone had the vote, let alone even now, as we know, we've just had an election where 37% of those who bothered to turn up to vote put in a government. So we're actually talking, even now in the West, democracy is very limited. I mean, it's obviously better than it is in the Middle East, but it's taken many, many centuries for us to get even to a sort of constitutional, relatively pluralistic system that we've got now. And we're on this year is the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Millions of Europeans killed each other. Including the most massive destruction of our heritage, to decide, to overthrow the Nazi regime that was terrorising the whole of Europe. So again, we should be very careful as Europeans to actually sort of make a moral judgment about these countries in the Middle East, because, in the long course of human history, the time it's going to take for them to catch up with what we've got is not going to be that great. Compared to, we look back, as you said, to Palmyra, this is thousands of years ago. I mean, they had despotisms in the Middle East then, and now what we need to do to actually move from that to even a sort of very, the sort of we could call our country, they're called liberal democracies because liberals are oligarchs. So we have surely you had
the clergy was one of the most significant power brokers within kind of medieval Europe and after that. But then it was replaced by bankers, by economics, if you like. But in the Arab world, in the Middle East, religion is still a fundamental aspect of society.
But so was it in Europe until the late 19th century, even right to the middle of the 20th century. I mean, everything that's now said about Muslims was said about Catholics in the early 20th century, There was a lot of, if you think about the fascist regimes in Italy, in Croatia, in Spain and Portugal, they were very closely allied with the Catholic Church, who were again very destructive of large parts of the past which they disapproved of, and they controlled the way that people lived in a very repressive way. And it took the trauma of the Second World War, particularly the Holocaust, to actually modernise the religion itself. I mean, obviously, we've just seen what's happened last week in Ireland, where they voted for gay marriage. This was a very definite break with a country whose identity for centuries was tied up with being Catholic because the English were Protestants.
If I could just get back to you on this point, if we could take this to Gearóid Ó Colmáin here. Last question to you. Is there any way in which the war in Syria can be stopped?
Is there any way the war in Syria can be stopped? I think the question really should be, is there any way that the American empire can be stopped? And that really is a question for Moscow and Beijing, because the war in Syria is not a war in isolation from all of the other conflicts that are taking place on the borders of Russia and China. We should understand that the war in Syria is part of a wider war to redivide the world, to create a new type of Baghdad Pact under NATO and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and to radicalize the countries all the ways to the eastern, to western China, to the Xinjiang province, and right into Central Asia, and of course the borders of Russia, and all the ways up, as we see in Ukraine and inside Russia. So there is this is part of a much broader war, and until Russia and China are capable of imposing their weight, as it were, in the region, and getting behind the Syrian government. They would probably need to be reinforced by now. I think we will need to see more Hezbollah involved. Russia may decide to get more involved. Iran could send in special forces. I think it's becoming critical. Syria is running out of resources. It doesn't have an infinite amount of troops. It is very tired. They're very tired. They still have a higher morale, of course, because they're defending their country. But they do need more regional support. China and Russia really need to make a decision now. Are they going to allow Syria to fall or not? Because if they allow Syria to fall, the war will come into Russia's backyard. It will be in the North Caucasus region. It will go into Xinjiang province in Western China, and they'll be fighting the exact same war as Assad. And they already are. So I think that the regional powers need to play a bigger role in resolving this crisis. And they need to get behind the Syrian government and kick out these Western-backed barbarians.
Okay. Gearóid Ó Colmáin, political analyst, thank you very much for joining us. If I could take this to Rina, ISIS is now committing among the worst atrocities all across the Middle East. Does this amount to cultural terrorism as a concept?
If this is cultural terrorism, yeah, I think what they're doing is very clear for everyone. Of course, in the first place, all the killing of people there in different regions, and the rapes and everything is horrifying. We need to put a lot of effort, try as much as we can to stop all this. But also, what I try to point out that we also take away or not encourage at least the reasons why young people join ISIS, or why they don't see any way probably to get democracy or to get their rights and radicalize. I mean, I see it happen. I follow Egypt very closely. I see it happen in Egypt, and more people are radicalizing. And if I stick to Egypt, for example, it's even the regime who's killing more innocent civilians than ISIS over there, while they have a big problem with ISIS as well in Sinai or Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, who joined ISIS. And Egyptian fighters are also going in Libya. There are even 2 Egyptian brigades fighting in Libya. So we really have to stop and fight them in Iraq, what we can, and Syria, but not keep on, bringing new recruits or helping this to create these reasons why people would. Join ISIS, and again, it's not meant like an easy solution, but we have to. It looks like we have to sit together and make a better plan. What I also find disturbing is like the West very much, like working together with some Arab countries to find terrorism, while these Arab countries have a whole complete different definition of terrorism, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Gulf states. They would say that journalists and activists and political opponents are all terrorists. Or like the Emirates, they have Iraqi political parties on their terror list. I mean, we really, as West, we have to think before we really work together with the Arab dictators to fight ISIS, because it can also make maybe things...
So Rina, your solution, would it advocate... having this process of democratization, which is non-military, which is more political, which is more social and cultural? What is the solution to finding a balance between this Eastern despotism, according to what some consider it, and Western democracy? Both concepts are not perfect, but what is the balanced solution?
What I would at least say, let's as West not make these cruel dictators stronger. What we are doing, like Egypt would go bankrupt if there would not be money coming in from outside, and now of course all this billions from the Gulf go to Egypt. But Egypt also needs Western investments, like 2 Dutch companies and Belgium. They are digging the Suez Canal for Sisi and so on. I mean, there is a lot. I think the West has a lot of leverage to say to dictators, stop, violating all the human rights. But the West is probably has no, what I come to the conclusion, let's speak for Europe, they don't have the guts to say this. While I think Egypt really needs to be political accepted and needs investments from Europe. It's not vice versa. So we really, and they're really not going to attack Israel. Sisi is very close with Israel, and also he's not going to close the Suez Canal if that would be a fear, because that's his only source of income right now, mainly. So I don't know why the West does not have the guts to raise the finger. We know in Europe what happened
be more potent,
when dictators came up. So we should try to not encourage dictators coming up in the Middle East, but we're doing it again.
Okay, Rina Najas, an Arabist and journalist, thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
If we could take this to Dr. Richard Barbarik, how do you define geopolitics in the Syria war? What are the most important countries playing significant roles?
Well, I think it goes back to two levels. There is obviously an internal dynamic. Whether you look at countries like Ukraine, for instance, at the moment, is that there's an internal dynamic that sets off the civil war. But the problem is in Syria, as in Ukraine, is that then once the war starts, that the external forces get involved with it. And obviously, as you can see in the Middle East at the moment, as we're in the aftermath of this failed American experiment to rebuild Iraq in its own image. And America is obviously involved because it's pivoted itself on the side of the Saudi and Israeli alliance against what's seen as this Iranian conspiracy against them. Whether or not we agree with that analysis isn't the one. But the argument, of course, as I said earlier on, the argument is that there are other people in America who are saying, well, no, actually the Saudis are the problem in the Middle East, and we should then switch sides and ally with the Iranians. So, as one of your previous speakers said, that obviously the Russians are supporting Assad, whether the Chinese are also, the Chinese just do business with anyone they can make money with, as far as I can see. So there are obviously outside influences. But I said the real, if you want to think about the core of any of these problems, it is to do with the fact that the Middle East is undergoing this transition between long-established systems of despotism that have been going across the Middle East, for thousands and thousands of years, and an attempt to create a more pluralistic democratic system. And the difficulty of this is, of course, that people have rival positions, and you get these totalitarian solutions being offered by people. They're easy solutions, aren't they, in a way? And if you have lots of young active males and they are attracted by this, if you've got a critical number of them, you can actually make a lot of impact. But actually, if you look at ISIS is not the Third Reich. It's not the Soviet Union. We're talking about a few tens of thousands of people. I mean, if the Americans seriously wanted to send in an army, they could destroy them in a few weeks. But they're not going to do that because they're not interested.
How would you perceive the role of Turkey?
Well, again, it's just one of the players in the area, isn't it? On one land they were, all of these powers, they're regional powers. So they're struggling for power over the region. They're allying with outside actors. And as I said, there's an internal dynamic. So there's layers of conflict on top of each other. I mean, as I said, there was this attempt to create a stable Middle East under American domination. This has failed. I mean, rather predictably, I think.
Okay.
And now out of that is what is the next solution? Unfortunately, the people of the Middle East are going through this experience which Europe went through in the 20th century.
I'll return to you on this issue, Dr. Richard.
Yeah.
And now from Lebanon, we have Mother Agnes Mariam Superior of the Monastery of St. James the Mutilated. Mother Agnes, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you. I am very happy to be again with you.
Even more happy. Thank you very much, Mother Agnes. Could you describe to us what is happening in Palmyra?
Well, it is something that it is difficult to describe because we have to put ourselves in the midst of those people, those innocent people who were living in peace in one of the highest civilized region in the world, Palmyra. And in a few hours, we had hordes of infrahumans mercenaries coming from more than 80 countries inside the desert, where they can be very easily supervised. And they have invaded everything. And one day after, they have killed, literally, they have beheaded 400 innocent people, among them women, children, elders, and they leave wherever they go, let it be in Iraq or in Syria, let it be in Iraq or in Syria, they leave everything completely destroyed. We have never seen such hordes, not even the Mughal or the Tatars.
Now,
in the worst and most dark days of the barbarians, we have never watched such scenes. And I really ask myself, are we in the 21st century? Was there a real desire to help Syria to enter in a better world of democracy and human rights? Where are we going? How is it possible that such things happens precisely when in Syria and
now,
in
Mother
Iraq?
Agnes, the Damascus Minister for Antiquities states that 80% of the museum in Palmyra has been taken to Damascus for safeguarding. How true is this?
Look, it is true, because the Department of Antiques in Syria are very much dedicated people and with a high professionalism. But nevertheless, even though 80% of the museum have been carried out, we don't have to forget that Palmyra in itself is a real museum of the world, where you have such beautiful things that you cannot move from a place to another. And we are really concerned about the security of those this inheritance. Now, moreover, in Palmyra, it's human beings that are, moving our hearts. Today, outside Palmyra, you have more than 30,000 IDPs. They are without home. They are without any information about their dear one, because they left behind them more or less 1,000 civilians. So really, I claim here to the consciousness, if there is still consciousness in the international community, isn't it time to stop all this? Isn't it time to come? If you really want to stop terror, why you don't stop it? Why, since the very day you re-entered in our regions, is the terror much more powerful than before? So we have also very, very bad news.
Mother Agnes, if you just let me interrupt you, and I couldn't bring you on here without asking you this, but the fate of minorities in Syria has been an issue of much concern. From your own experience and knowledge as to what is happening, what is truly occurring to the Syrian Christian population, which is under ISIS control?
There is no Christian population under ISIS control, because
categorically.
Everybody... No, they are not. Either they are killed, or they have to leave, and or to pay the jizya. But to pay the jizya means that you have to pay also the sexual jizya, which means that everybody leaves. So we can't say that there are really Christians that live today under ISIS. ISIS is not a state. ISIS is a bunch of mercenaries that were more or less trained in very professional security companies, and they are paid to do what they are doing. Today, we are no more naive. We know what is happening. What is happening can only happen because there is a real coordination between those who have satellites, those who can really watch over the migration on the ground, and those who are migrating on the ground. Palmyra is the
Okay.
not only,
Mother Agnes, Mother Agnes,
yes.
we're very short on time. If you could just answer really quickly. Where do you see the future of Syria heading in under a minute, please?
What?
Where do you see the future of Syria heading in under a minute, please?
There is no future for Syria as long as there is like this a breach of the international laws and the humanitarian international laws. Let it be said to everybody, especially to the great powers. What they are doing is a real crime against humanity. We have had also another priest that has been abducted 1 week ago from nearby Palmyra. What is sacred is being completely driven and given to those hordes. This is enough.
Okay. Mother Agnes Mariam, Superior of the Monastery of St. James the Mutilated, thank you very, very much for being on the show.
God bless you.
Okay. Dr. Richard Barbrook, final question to you. Where do you see Syria's war heading now?
Well, I think it's up to the Syrians at the end of the day, because they're going to have to decide who they're going to fight for, and if they are willing to sacrifice themselves and their wealth to come to a certain outcome, aren't they? At the end of the day, I don't think outside forces can intervene. They could help one side or the other side, but it's got to be up to the Syrian people themselves. And unfortunately, it seems to be one of these civil wars that's going to drag on, and it could end up like in Lebanon with a permanent partition of the country, couldn't it? I mean, this seems to be one of the things. If you read the American military websites, the neocon websites, they are openly talking about a repartition of the Middle East. So this might be one of the ways that Syria could be heading. The trouble is, of course, as I said, I don't think that there's actually, though it's sold as a new form of stability, that they're blaming the divisions after the Second World War for the First World War for the instability at the moment. It actually could be, as I said, Pepe Escobar's phrase, the empire of chaos. It just creates constant instability, and then in a way that's the aim. If it can't be an American-dominated Middle East, it's going to be a perpetual civil war.
That's all we have time
actually
for.
In the interest of the outside powers, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for.
Okay,
But
thank you very much.
Dr. Richard Barbrook, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at the University of Westminster, joined us live from our studio. Thank you very much. And a big thank you to all of my guests today. We leave you with an insight into Syria's treasured history.
Palmyra is known as the Pearl of the Desert, a source of pride for every Syrian and a fundamental part of Syrian national heritage. An oasis in the Syrian desert, northeast of Damascus, Palmyra contains the monumental ruins of a great city that was one of the most important cultural centers of the ancient world. From the 1st to the 2nd century, the art and architecture of Palmyra, standing at the crossroads of several civilizations, married Greco-Roman techniques with local traditions and Persian influences. Palmyra exerted a decisive influence on the evolution of neoclassical architecture and modern urbanization. The city offers the consummate example of an ancient urbanized complex, for the most part protected, with its large public monuments such as the Agora, the theatre, and the temples. Alongside these, the inhabited quarters are preserved, and there are immense cemeteries outside the fortified enceinte. Palmyran art, for which the great museums of the world now vie, unites the forms of Greco-Roman art with indigenous elements and Iranian influences in a strongly original style. As the crossroads of several civilizations, it is here that unique creations came into existence, a treasure of Syria and the Middle East.
Thanks for watching Syria Talks. Till next time.